1,000-year-old fortress rests on the top of a mountain. At its feet, you can see a river of soldiers marching through fields devastated by fire and terror. At the summit, the footprints of ancient monks now mingle with those of German paratroopers determined to resist. The place is named Monte Cassino and is located in the heart of the Gustav Line, the last great defense of the Nazis in southern Italy. For months, it has been an impenetrable bastion for the Allies, and it will soon become legend. Sacrifice, strategy, and desperation are some of the ingredients that made this battle one of the most brutal of the Second World War. More than 10,000 of Hitler's soldiers were killed, but at a high price. In this new military history video, we will go through the 4 great assaults carried out by the Allied troops to try to penetrate one of the most ironclad defenses of the entire conflict. Put on your helmet and join us, because we are about to dive into one of the most epic clashes of this incredible competition.
With firing, then I remember my rifle being jammed up about 3 rounds, and it jammed, I couldn't use it, and I thought I'll have to make my way somewhere else. It's still pitch black, and as I came, this grenade came over.
The Battle of Monte Cassino was one of the most important and bloody campaigns on the Italian front during World War II. Its main objective was to break the defensive line that blocked the Allied advance towards Rome, as a previous step towards the heart of the Third Reich. The road to the fierce fighting began with the landing in Sicily in July 1943. A large force composed of American, French, Canadian, and British Empire troops arrived victoriously from the North African front. After gaining a foothold in the territory, with the impetus to continue forward in their mission to end fascism and Nazism, they moved to southern Italy to continue their journey towards the nation's capital. Benito Mussolini's leadership had failed, so King Victor Emmanuel III devised a plan to overthrow him and save his monarchy from disaster. With the help of members of the Fascist Party who had become disenchanted with the Duce's actions, they arrested him. For this reason, the forces he commanded surrendered in September 1943, and the Germans assumed direct control of the country, establishing defensive lines to halt the Allied advance. The most formidable of these was the Gustav Line, which ran across the peninsula from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic. This was no simple trench or defensive wall. It was a complex system of integrated fortifications that took full advantage of the mountainous terrain of central Italy. Its features included elevated positions, with strategic points in the Apennine mountain range, from which there was a clear view of the Alliance's movements. But that was not all. It also had heavy artillery hidden in underground bunkers and minefields that made incursion by tanks and infantry extremely dangerous. Another peculiarity of the Gustav Line was the use of weather conditions and rugged terrain to its advantage. During the winter months, rain and snow further complicated Allied efforts to advance. Rivers, such as the Rapido, became insurmountable obstacles due to the strong currents. However, at the center of this defensive system, there was a unique strategic point, Monte Cassino. This mountainous formation was crowned by a 1,000-year-old Benedictine abbey. From there, German troops could observe and control everything that happened in the Liri Valley, a vital route to Rome.
Hitler hoped that a successful defense in Italy would mean that the Allies would think twice about D-Day. For the Allies, this is the biggest combined attack they've mounted so far, and their greatest test. The German command structure was simple, their task to hold the line. In contrast, the Allies had a complex multinational chain of command, with over a dozen different nations involved, and much disagreement.
By late 1943, the Allied advance in Italy had slowed due to mountainous terrain, poor weather conditions, and German resistance. German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who was in charge of designing the Nazi defenses, had turned the rugged terrain into a death trap for the enemy. By January 1944, the opposing troops knew that in order to advance toward the capital, they had to break through the Gustav Line. With the objective clear, it was decided to begin an extensive and brutal campaign that would unleash hell on Hitler's men. The Battle of Monte Cassino began on January 17th, with the first assault led by General Harold Alexander, commander of the Allied 15th Army Group, and General Mark W. Clark, commander of the U.S. 5th Army. They decided to attack the Gustav Line from two directions. While one force would attempt to outflank the Germans by landing at Anzio, another would launch a frontal offensive against Monte Cassino to open the way through the Liri Valley. The plan involved British and American troops, supported by heavy artillery. The Americans were given the critical task of crossing the Rapido River, a tough natural obstacle to Nazi positions. If they succeeded, the defensive system in a key sector would be breached. However, the advance would be more difficult than they imagined. The crossing of that waterway was to be the first phase of the plan. During the night of January 20th, American soldiers attempted to cross the river using boats and improvised bridges. However, the current was much stronger than expected, and they were swept away before they could even approach the opposite bank. To make matters worse, the units that managed to cross the river encountered intense resistance from the Third Reich. The Germans had prepared the ground with extensive minefields, barbed wire, and artillery. The troops that did manage to land found themselves exposed in an open field where they were mopped up by enemy machine guns and mortars. Casualties were catastrophic. Attempts to build portable bridges under enemy fire also failed. Engineers trying to build them were shot down before they could complete their work. As deaths mounted and American troops remained trapped on the wrong side of the river, it became clear that the operation was doomed.
Even before the Americans can get to the Monastery Hill, they have to fight across gullies and ravines packed with mines and booby traps.
On February the 7th, Clark orders a final assault on the mountain. Within just a few days, the Americans suffer over 2,000 casualties and have to withdraw.
After 2 days of uninterrupted combat and thousands of men killed, General Clark ordered a retreat. The Rapido crossing had become a death trap. The Allied High Command had seriously underestimated the German capacity to resist in the area, as well as the conditions of the terrain. Thus, the first assault ended in abject failure. The battle had a high human cost due to the losses suffered, and while the German defenses remained intact, the Allies had not achieved a single significant advance.
Of the 4,000 men who made the attack, fewer than half return. The rest are killed, captured, wounded, or missing in action. The Germans have lost just a few hundred men.
Air support and coordination of forces had failed. Enemy positions remained intact. The plan had failed. However, the Allies did not let frustration cloud them. A change of strategy was quickly proposed, and a second assault was ready to be launched. Not only was Monte Cassino a natural mountain fortress, but German troops also dominated the Italian skies. Elite paratroopers were effectively using the high ground to slow down any Allied advance. One of the most striking features was the aforementioned abbey, a monastery founded in 529 by Saint Benedict. It was situated on the top of a hill, dominating the surrounding area and providing a strategic view of the Liri Valley. The Allies believed that the Nazis were using the site as an observation point, and from there, they coordinated artillery attacks on their troops. The second assault was planned largely as a response to the need to eliminate that advantage. Although there was much doubt as to whether the Germans were actually occupying the abbey, pressure to destroy what was perceived as an enemy stronghold was mounting. In addition, Allied commanders wanted to seize the opportunity to launch a new offensive before the forces at Anzio, which had landed on the Italian coast in January, became trapped in their own beachhead. The bombardment of the monastery was one of the most controversial points of the operation. The New Zealand commander, Bernard Freyberg, who was in command of the troops for the second assault, was one of the main promoters of the attack. He believed that as long as the space was standing, the Germans could use it as an impregnable fortress from which to dominate the conflict. After a long debate, it was decided to proceed.
Frustrated by the strength of these German defenses, the Allies have resorted to a simple but devastating solution. They are to completely destroy it. They believe the heavily fortified monastery may be being used by German troops. It isn't.
On February 15, 1944, more than 229 Allied bombers razed the Monte Cassino Abbey. In one of the largest air offensives of the Italian campaign, they dropped some 1,400 tons of bombs on the monastery, reducing its ancient structures to rubble and ashes. The building, which had remained intact for centuries, was almost completely destroyed in a matter of hours. However, the offensive did not have the expected effect. In fact, it has been debated for decades whether it was a tactical error. Later reports indicated that there were no German troops in the abbey before the bombing. The attack destroyed a cultural monument and allowed the German defenders to use the ruins to further fortify their position. Nazi paratroopers occupied the site filled with rubble and crumbling walls, which offered them cover and ideal firing points to keep the Allied forces at bay. By bombing the abbey, they created the space of resistance they so longed to destroy. Following the air raid, a new ground operation was carried out. This time, it would be led by soldiers from New Zealand and India, including Gurkha troops, fierce fighters known for their bravery and skill. One of their main objectives was Mount Calvary, a hill heavily defended by the Germans. The Allies attempted to advance with tanks, but the terrain, riddled with rubble and craters from the bombing, made the task difficult. Faced with this impediment, the Gurkhas made several heroic attempts to take the enemy position. However, they were repelled by Nazi artillery and machine guns, who now used the ruins of the abbey as defensive points. Once again, the efforts of the Allied troops met with failure. Poor coordination, misuse of bombing, and relentless German resistance were devastating for the mission. Thousands of casualties had been added to the list.
They are holed up in reinforced cellars as part of the gigantic Gustav line that crosses Italy. For over 2 months, the Allies have been unable to break this defensive line. Now they are to resort to a massive air attack on the Germans in the town. It's a desperate move.
On the 15th of March 1944, the third assault began. Although the 2 initial defeats had affected the morale of the soldiers, there was no other option but to continue the fight until the Gustav line was broken. The command for the new incursion fell to General Oliver Leese of the British forces, who would be accompanied by New Zealanders and Indians. Unlike the previous attacks, the plan focused on a more concentrated assault on the town of Cassino, rather than trying to simultaneously take the heights around the abbey. The Allies hoped that concentrating their firepower in a smaller area would facilitate a successful advance and reduce the dispersion of their troops. The offensive began with a massive bombing raid. More than 600 planes dropped around 1,000 tons of explosives on the German positions. However, the effect was limited. The Nazis took refuge in underground bunkers and again used the remaining ruins to strengthen their defensive positions. The air attack had only created more difficult terrain for the assault to advance. Infantry and armored vehicles encountered great difficulties, and German artillery hidden in the rubble inflicted heavy casualties. In essence, the third raid was another strategic failure for the Allies, but this time, albeit in a limited way, the village of Cassino had been penetrated. Some fighters reached the destroyed buildings and engaged in hand-to-hand combat against the Nazi defenders.
The fighting in the town was extremely close. It wasn't uncommon for enemy troops to occupy the same ruined house, sometimes unaware of each other's presence. Prisoners were inevitable.
This new defeat had left us with great lessons about what could be effective and what could not, preparing the ground for the final battle. On May 11th, the fourth and final chapter of this incredible conflict began.
Dann auf einmal 11 Uhr abends.
And suddenly, at 11 p.m., it was as if someone had put on all the lights. Everything was bright and we could see all the mountains towards Naples.
The final operation began with a massive artillery attack that lit up the night. More than 1,600 Allied guns opened fire on German positions along the entire Cassino front, creating an intense bombardment that lasted for several hours. The attack was much more coordinated and precise than the previous ones. Its objective was to destroy enemy trenches and demoralize the troops by cutting off their lines of communication. Then, it was the turn of the advance on the Liri Valley, a natural route that led into the interior of Italy. The British and American forces crossed the Garigliano River and, at a slow but steady pace, faced German resistance. Air support helped maintain the momentum of the attack for several days. This time, a new army came into play with a crucial task. These were the Polish troops under General Anders, who had the difficult task of taking the heights of Monte Cassino, including the famous Abbey. Throughout the offensive, these soldiers advanced little by little towards the summit, suffering heavy losses due to strong German resistance. However, the attacks continued without rest, and finally the long-awaited objective was achieved.
The German assaults seem increasingly suicidal. Out of the 200 men who began the counterattack, only 40 now remain.
We came as far as the lower hairpin bend, and there we encountered heavy fire from the ruins of the castle and realized that we could not reach the castle with so few men.
On 18 May 1944, after 7 days of intense fighting, Polish troops entered the ruins of the monastery, finding that the Germans had evacuated their positions during the previous night. The Nazi paratroopers, exhausted after months of fighting, had been ordered to retreat towards the Hitler Line, a new defensive position further north. The fall of Monte Cassino marked the close of one of the toughest and longest battles of the Italian campaign. The cost was extremely high for both sides. It is estimated that the Allies suffered more than 55,000 casualties between dead and wounded, while some 10,000 Germans were killed, with a similar number wounded and captured. Despite the victory against the Nazis, the battle is still remembered for the huge number of fallen soldiers and the devastation of the historic abbey. Ultimately, the capture of Monte Cassino paved the way for the capture of Rome, which fell into Allied hands on the 4th of June 1944, just days before the Normandy landings. Strategically, although the liberation of the Italian capital was an important achievement, most of the German forces managed to withdraw in an orderly manner, prolonging the campaign in the country until the end of the war in Europe. In short, the Battle of Monte Cassino stood out as a symbol of the tenacity and sacrifice of the soldiers involved, and is a reminder of the human cost of fighting in the difficult terrain of Italy. Now, after having experienced this long and bloody battle, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us to the end. We look forward to meeting you again in our next military history video.